In the heart of Rome, as the sky still held the pale grey of night, the city was wrapped in a quiet hush. The streets, often filled with footsteps and shouting vendors, were now still. A faint breeze passed between stone columns and ivy-covered walls, carrying with it the soft scent of damp clay tiles and distant fig trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog stirred and let out a single bark, quickly fading into silence. Within a modest domus, tucked along a cobbled side street near the Aventine Hill, a Roman citizen stirred from sleep. The household had not yet come to life. The lamps had long since burned out, and the air held the gentle coolness of the early hour. Only the faintest hints of morning light crept through the slatted wooden shutters, drawing soft lines across the painted walls. The citizen remained still for a moment, wrapped in linen blankets, letting the air of the room settle around him. The bed, made of smooth wood and woven ropes, creaked slightly as he sat up, feet touching the cool stone floor. The distant call of a rooster could just be heard, muffled by thick walls and courtyard gardens. It was not yet time for the city to wake, but it was time for him to begin. He moved quietly, stepping across the bedroom to wash. A ceramic basin waited on a small wooden stand, filled with water drawn the night before. It was cool to the touch, refreshing. He cupped his hands, splashing it gently over his face, watching the ripples settle. There was no mirror, only the faint reflection in the bowl's surface and the feel of his own hands. Dressing was a slow, mindful task. A simple tunic, woven from soft wool, pulled over his head and tied gently with a belt. Sandals waited near the doorway, their leather straps still bearing dust from the previous day's walk. He picked them up and sat on a stool, fastening each with practiced hands, listening to the quiet creaks of the house around him, the gentle shift of wood beams, the faraway echo of a servant's footsteps in the courtyard. He stepped into the atrium, the central space of the house, open to the sky. The impluvium, the shallow pool that collected rainwater, sat still and dark, reflecting the last stars before they vanished into dawn. A single fig leaf floated in its center, turning slowly in the water's faint current. Around the courtyard, the columns cast long shadows, reaching gently across mosaic floors and painted walls. The air smelled of stone and soil, and a faint hint of lavender from the nearby garden. The domus, though not large, was well kept, a sign of quiet dignity. There was no rush, no noise, only the soft rhythm of breath, the feel of smooth tile underfoot, and the understanding that a new day had begun, not with haste or clamour, but with stillness. The kitchen remained empty, the cook not yet awake. Bread from the previous day was wrapped in linen and left on a tray. He tore off a small piece, chewing slowly as he stood near the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops beyond. The world outside remained hushed, the city still gathering its strength for the coming day. This hour belonged to no one. It was not for business or duty or speech. It was for listening, to the soft rustling of trees, to distant footsteps on stone, to the quiet hum of a city not yet awake. And so he stood, a Roman citizen alone in the pale morning, wrapped in his own thoughts, preparing to meet the day not with force, but with calm, just as his ancestors had done, just as others would, long after he was gone. As the first golden thread of sunlight stretched across the tiled rooftops of Rome, the house began to breathe with quiet movement. The domus was still hushed, but the air had changed. The lingering coolness of night was slowly giving way to the gentle warmth of day. A breeze passed through the open atrium, rustling the linen curtains and carrying the scent of laurel from the garden. In the sleeping quarters, servants began to stir. Sandals padded softly across mosaic floors. Wooden doors creaked as they were opened and closed with care. The household was not loud, it was never loud, but it moved with purpose, each person familiar with their task. The citizen returned to the small washroom beside the atrium. A servant had already refilled the ceramic basin with fresh water from the cistern, and a cloth had been placed neatly beside it, folded and damp. The cool splash of water once more touched his face, this time more fully, refreshing and clearing the last weight of sleep from his eyes. He rinsed his hands, then ran the cloth across his neck and arms, taking slow, deliberate motions that matched the calm of the morning. Beside him, a small bronze mirror caught the rising light. Its surface was slightly warped, but enough to reflect his features as he combed his hair with an ivory-handled comb. He paused briefly, watching his own face. Not out of vanity, but out of quiet habit. The same face he had seen every morning for years, slightly older now, but still familiar. From a nearby shelf, he chose a clean tunic, freshly laundered, soft to the touch. It smelled faintly of rosemary, a common herb used when drying clothes in the courtyard. The tunic was plain, but well made, dyed a subtle beige from walnut husks, tied at the waist with a woven belt of muted red. It draped cleanly over his shoulders, the wool light and breathable. He selected a simple fibula, a bronze clasp, to secure the fabric at one shoulder. It was shaped like a laurel leaf, well worn and handed down from his father. It was not extravagant, but it was personal, and he placed it with care. His sandals waited by the door, and as he stepped into them, he flexed his toes against the worn leather. The straps were soft from years of walking the same streets, past the Forum, the temples, the public fountains. The soles had molded perfectly to the shape of his feet. Comfortable, trusted. On a nearby bench, a servant had left a small satchel containing a wax tablet and stylus, items he always brought when leaving the house. Even if he had no plans to write, he preferred to carry them. Sometimes a thought would come, and there was comfort in knowing it could be caught on warm wax and carried home. He walked back into the atrium, the light now pouring gently into the open roof above, shimmering across the water of the impluvium. The fig leaf still floated there, turning lazily. His home was awake now, not loud, not hurried, but alive. The servants moved with quiet confidence. A small brazier had been lit in the kitchen to heat water. Somewhere down the hall, the cook's soft voice could be heard discussing ingredients for the day's meals. The scent of baking bread had begun to creep in, still faint but rising. He paused once more in the center of the atrium, hands resting gently on his belt, eyes turned upward to the light. The day had not yet begun in earnest, but he was ready. And with that, he stepped forward, his pace measured, his heart calm, to meet whatever gentle rhythm the city would bring. The kitchen of the domus had begun to glow with the soft orange light of the morning brazier. The stone walls held onto the night's coolness, but the slow kindling of heat warmed the air gently, not harshly. A few copper pans hung on the wall, and small clay jars lined the shelves, each labelled with scratches or bits of faded paint, one for salt, one for honey, another for dried figs. A servant moved quietly around the room, placing food onto a wooden tray with smooth, practiced hands. There was no feast, just a light, familiar meal to begin the day. A small, round loaf of bread, still slightly warm from being reheated, was wrapped in cloth. Beside it, A few dark olives sat in a shallow dish. A wedge of soft cheese, lightly salted, rested next to a cluster of dates and dried apricots. A small bowl of honey gleamed in the morning light. The citizen entered without announcement, nodding gently to the servant who bowed once and left the room. The air smelled of toasted grain and olive oil, subtle and comforting. He sat near a small table by the open window, where sunlight streamed in and the sounds of distant footsteps echoed along the alleyways outside. He took a bite of the bread first, coarse on the outside, soft within, tearing it slowly with his hands. Then a slice of cheese, just enough to soften the saltiness of the olives. The honey was thick and fragrant, drawn from hives outside the city weeks ago. He dipped the corner of the bread in it, savouring the sweetness in contrast to the sharp tang of the fruit. There was a cup of watered wine as well, light and cool, not for indulgence, but for refreshment. Romans rarely drank wine undiluted. It was about balance, moderation, ease. The taste was mild, familiar. Birdsong filtered in through the open window. A cart rattled faintly in the distance, wooden wheels creaking over stone. Somewhere, a street vendor's voice called out the day's wares, though the words were too far away to be clear. Inside, everything remained still. On a low bench nearby sat the wax tablet he had packed earlier, along with a folded scrap of parchment bearing yesterday's notes. Names of clients, a short list of items to purchase, a phrase in Greek he had meant to remember. But for now, there was no need to reach for it. This was the hour for quiet. He finished his meal slowly, without rush. There was no schedule written in stone, no horn or bell to demand his attention. Just the sun's slow climb across the window, the whisper of the breeze, and the calm rhythm of chewing, sipping, breathing. When the food was gone, he wiped his fingers gently on a cloth and stood, letting the light warm his face. The tray would be taken away soon. The kitchen would be used again for lunch, and later for dinner. But in this moment, it held only stillness and the scent of honeyed bread. He stepped out into the atrium again, pausing by the impluvium to watch the water ripple slightly from the breeze. The bread had filled him, the olives awakened his tongue, and the wine had cleared the fog of early morning. He was ready now, not for conquest or urgency, but for the slow unfolding of another Roman day. As the sun rose higher above Rome's rooftops, the domus gradually began to hum with life. It was not sudden or loud, just a soft layering of movement as each person in the house followed their quiet morning routine. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, mingling with the herbal fragrance of laurel leaves brushing against the courtyard wall. The citizen stepped through the hallway into the peristyle, the open-air garden that sat like a calm green heart within the home. Columns surrounded the walkway, their bases cool and pale in the early light. Small hedges bordered the space, and flowering plants, carefully tended, added splashes of colour between the stone paths. A small fountain murmured steadily in the centre, a gentle trickle that echoed faintly off the walls. He passed a servant sweeping dust from the mosaic floor, her head bowed slightly in respect. He returned the gesture with a nod, acknowledging her presence not as a command but as a greeting. This household ran not through shouting or fear, but through rhythm, quiet, dependable, and respectful. Near the kitchen corridor, he saw the cook carefully inspecting a basket of fresh produce delivered earlier that morning. Leeks, onions, broad beans, and a small sack of lentils. A jar of oil stood beside it. The cook held each item in hand with care, checking for bruises, gauging the weight. They exchanged a brief word. The menu for the day was simple, but well considered. Further down the hall, one of the younger servants was polishing a bronze lamp. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his task, running the cloth along the curve of the metal with slow, even strokes. A child, the servant's son perhaps, peeked out from behind a pillar, his eyes wide, his steps still unsteady. The citizen offered a soft smile, and the boy ducked shyly behind the column, only to peek out again. In the tablinum, the open reception room just off the atrium, his wife sat near a low table, reviewing a tablet filled with household notes, lists of stored oil, deliveries of wool, expenses for the past month. She wore a simple stola, her hair tied back with ribbon, her posture relaxed. She looked up and greeted him not with words, but with a look. A quiet familiarity forged through years of shared mornings just like this. They exchanged a few phrases about the day ahead, a visit to the forum, letters to respond to, a neighbour's dinner invitation. There was no need to rush. Everything would unfold in its own time, as it always did. A slave entered with a tray of fresh water and a towel. Another followed with a small jar of olive oil, placing it carefully by the wash basin in case the citizen wished to anoint his skin before stepping outside. Every motion was smooth, unobtrusive. The house ran not on orders, but on understanding. He paused in the atrium once more before preparing to leave. The impluvium still reflected the sky, now blue and clear. The fig leaf from earlier had drifted to the edge of the water, caught gently against the side. The house was calm, federal, awake. Every person was doing what they had done the day before and would do again tomorrow. There was a strange comfort in that, not boredom, but reliability. A shared quiet purpose that connected them all, from master to child to cook. He stepped toward the outer door, sandals soft against the worn stone floor. The day was beginning, and so was the city. The street outside the domus opened to the slow rhythm of the waking city. Rome, grand and eternal, stirred with a murmur rather than a roar. Sandals whispered over stone, carts creaked in the distance, and birds called softly from rooftops lined with terracotta tiles. The morning light spilled down between buildings, warming the marble walls and casting soft shadows along the alleys. The citizen walked with an unhurried pace, his steps steady on the familiar stones of the Via Sacra. The road curved gently toward the heart of the city, where the Forum waited, not as a place of spectacle this morning, but as a quiet centre of Roman life. The breeze brushed the folds of his tunic, carrying scents of early bread, olive oil, and faint traces of incense from a nearby shrine. Vendors were only just setting up their stalls along the edges of the square. One arranged baskets of dates and figs, another stacked clay pots in neat rows. A young boy swept dust from a blanket, where he would soon display leather sandals. None shouted yet. All moved quietly, hands focused, faces calm. The Forum itself spread wide before him, not chaotic, but purposeful. Columns stood tall and straight like sentinels of stone, their shadows falling long across the paved ground. The steps of the basilica were mostly empty, save for a pair of magistrates speaking softly in togas, edged with purple. Pigeons fluttered from roof to roof, never landing too long in one place. He paused by the rostra, the raised platform where speakers addressed the crowd on more lively days. This morning it was silent, its steps cool and clean. There would be no fiery speeches yet, no debates, no declarations. just the rustle of parchment from a scribe unrolling a notice on the public board. He read the lines without hurry. Taxes collected, a shipment of grain arrived at Ostia, a merchant's marriage announced in neat Latin script. Passing the temple of Saturn, he glanced up at the sculpted faces watching from above. The columns reached into the sky, worn smooth by centuries of wind and touch. A priest swept the marble steps, gathering leaves that had drifted in overnight. The golden statue within had not yet been uncovered for public display. It would remain behind its curtains until the day's rituals began. A group of young students sat nearby, their teacher gesturing gently as he spoke of Cicero's words. The boys listened with uneven attention, some doodling in wax tablets, others watching the breeze catch the folds of their master's toga. The citizen paused to listen for a moment, not to learn, but to enjoy the tone, the rhythm, the calm cadence of words passed down like quiet music. Further along, he passed the tabularium, Rome's records held within its great stone walls. Scribes moved in and out with small bundles of parchment and wax, nodding politely to each other. A clerk offered a quick glance and a knowing smile. They had met before, perhaps last year, perhaps longer ago. Crossing the center of the forum, he stepped around a shallow pool where a few coins glimmered beneath the water. The pool's surface shimmered gently, reflecting the sky and the edge of the Capitoline Hill beyond. He did not toss a coin today. He simply watched as one small leaf landed on the water's surface and drifted toward the edge. The forum was alive, but softly so, not with noise, but with presence. It was not a place of grandeur this morning. It was a place of quiet exchange, of intention, of the steady flow of life as it always had been. And as he stepped once more onto the stone path leading away from the square, the citizen took a deep breath of warm air and exhaled slowly, content to let the city continue its gentle pulse behind him. From the forum, the walk to the neighborhood baths was a short and familiar one. The citizen followed a winding street lined with bakeries and shaded arcades, where the warmth of the sun mixed with the soft scent of baking loaves. The morning bustle had begun, but it remained gentle. The bathhouse would be calm this early, long before the crowds arrived in the afternoon. He approached the entrance to the Thermae, a modest public bath not far from his home, smaller than the grand imperial complexes, but clean, well-tended, and familiar. Steam rose faintly from vents above the tiled roof, and the soft sound of running water echoed within its walls. The doorkeeper, seated on a low stool by the entrance, greeted him with a quiet nod. A small bowl of coins sat beside him, already holding a few bronze asses from earlier visitors. The citizen placed his payment inside and stepped through the arched doorway into a corridor of smooth stone and shaded light. Inside, the air was warmer, scented with oil and damp limestone. The dressing room, or apoditerium, was mostly empty. A pair of elderly men quietly spoke in the corner as they removed their tunics, their conversation low and unhurried. The citizen removed his sandals and belt, folded his tunic, and placed his belongings into a niche along the wall. A young attendant offered him a strigil, a curved blade used to scrape away oil and dirt, along with a small jar of perfumed olive oil. He nodded in thanks and moved slowly into the next chamber. The tepidarium greeted him with soft light and gentle heat. The room was warm, not hot, with a low domed ceiling designed to hold the steam. Mosaic tiles glistened underfoot, their surfaces slightly damp, but not slippery. A gentle murmur of conversation filled the air, echoing softly off the stone. Here, he paused, allowing the warmth to loosen his muscles and quiet his mind. After a few minutes, he continued to the caldarium, the hottest room of the baths. The heat wrapped around him like a blanket, moist and heavy, but not unpleasant. A large marble basin stood at the center, filled with steaming water. A few other visitors sat along the benches, their eyes half closed, breathing slow and deep. He seated himself on a stone ledge, letting the warmth seep into his body. The attendant approached again, this time offering a ladle of water to pour gently over his shoulders. The sensation was immediate, relaxing, purifying, soft. Using the strigil, he scraped away the oil and sweat from his arms and chest, then rinsed with another scoop of water. No one spoke loudly. The occasional splash of water, the faint echo of a laugh, or the whisper of a towel being wrung out, these were the only sounds. After time passed, unmeasured and slow, he returned to the tepidarium and sat for a while longer, allowing his body to cool slightly. He then made his way to the frigidarium, where a cold plunge pool waited. The water was brisk and awakening, and he entered it gradually, inhaling deeply as the coolness surrounded him. It was not meant for shock, but for balance. When he stepped out, he was handed a clean towel and guided back toward the dressing room. His tunic was returned neatly folded. He dressed slowly, refreshed, the weight of the morning lifted from his shoulders. Before leaving, he paused once more in the atrium of the baths. A small fountain burbled in the corner. An older man sat nearby, drying his feet and humming an old tune. The citizen smiled quietly, nodded, and stepped back into the Roman sunlight. The city was warmer now, louder, but he walked with a new calm, the kind found only in steam and silence, in oil and stone, in the ancient rhythm of cleansing, a ritual older than memory, carried out with care every day beneath these quiet, domed ceilings. As he left the bathhouse, the air outside greeted him like a soft cloth warmed by the sun. Rome, now fully awake, was alive with subtle motion. The sounds of sandals against stone were steadier, more frequent. A baker called gently from a doorway. A group of children walked together in pairs, their laughter carrying lightly down the alley before fading into the wider street. The citizen took a familiar route, not rushed, but purposeful. He passed beneath the shadow of an arch, the stone above etched with names of emperors long gone. To his left, a statue of Minerva watched with timeless eyes, her marble form bright in the morning light. A pigeon landed gently on her helmet, pecked at something unseen, then fluttered away. Rome was full of such figures, gods carved into stillness, emperors raised upon pedestals, mythic heroes frozen in mid-step. Some stood alone in quiet gardens. Others lined avenues, half forgotten, but never fully ignored. As the citizen walked, he nodded faintly to those he passed, not out of superstition, but respect. These statues had stood longer than many homes. They were part of the city's breath. He turned a corner and approached a small temple, modest but well kept. Its columns reached skyward in pale white, trimmed with red and gold at the top. A pair of braziers smouldered on either side of the entrance, their smoke rising in faint ribbons toward the tiled roof. A priest stood nearby, arranging fresh laurel branches beside the altar. He moved without haste, his movements smooth from years of repetition. The citizen paused a moment at the temple steps. He did not enter. It was not a festival day, nor did he carry an offering. But he stood in stillness, breathing in the incense that drifted through the open doors. Inside, a statue of Fortuna stood, one hand holding a cornucopia, the other resting lightly on a spinning wheel. Her expression was soft, almost content. He closed his eyes briefly, whispering a few quiet words, not loud enough to carry, not formal enough to be a prayer. Just a few thoughts offered into the stillness. Then he turned, bowing his head slightly to the temple and stepping back onto the street. Further along, he passed a public fountain where water trickled from the mouth of a carved lion. A child held a small cup beneath the stream, filling it with care. An older woman leaned against the stone wall nearby, waiting her turn with a woven basket at her feet. The citizen smiled politely, continuing on. A statue of Augustus stood near the corner of the basilica, arm extended in eternal gesture. His robe hung in carved folds, his eyes gazing past the rooftops as if still watching over the empire he shaped. Vines had begun to grow along the pedestal, curling gently around the stone like fingers in sleep. Here and there, small shrines nestled in the niches of buildings, offerings of fruit, little lamps, coins left by unknown hands. The gods of Rome were everywhere, quiet and unassuming. They didn't demand attention. They simply remained, like the city itself, unmoved by haste or noise. The citizen turned into a quieter lane, the stones underfoot warm now. A cool breeze brushed through the corridor, stirring his tunic lightly. Overhead, laundry hung between buildings, fluttering like sails above the street. Somewhere, a lute played a slow tune, and for a moment time seemed to stretch like golden light across the forum. He walked on, not to arrive anywhere in particular, but because Rome itself was a destination. Its temples, its statues, its shaded corners, all part of the same quiet story, unfolding gently under the watchful eyes of history. The street opened gently into a shaded colonnade near the forum, where a handful of citizens had already gathered, some seated on low stone benches, others standing in quiet circles, robes softly brushing as they shifted. The sounds here were hushed, almost reverent. No merchants shouted, no carts passed through. It was a place for thought, not trade. At the center of the colonnade stood a man in a simple white toga, unadorned by rank or office. He was older, his beard grey and well-kept, and his posture relaxed but deliberate. He held no scroll, no written text. Only his voice, calm and steady, filled the space. He spoke not to convince, but to consider. The citizen approached without hurry, stepping into the cool shadow of the portico. He found a spot on a low bench near the edge of the group, folding his hands over his lap. The voice of the philosopher carried gently, shaped not by volume, but by clarity. And so we return to the question of temperance, the philosopher was saying, his tone even and soft. Is it better to want little, or to learn how to live with much without longing for more? A man nearby nodded slightly, his eyes half closed, perhaps in thought or rest. Another took slow notes on a wax tablet, pausing often to reflect. The philosopher continued. He spoke of balance, of patience, of how wisdom was less about knowing everything and more about learning how to listen, to others, to silence, to the passage of time. His words moved like ripples across a calm pond, spreading gently but deeply. The citizen leaned back slightly, letting the cool stone support him as he listened. He didn't need to agree or even follow every thought. The value was not in the answers, but in the presence, the sound of a thoughtful voice echoing under Roman arches, mingling with birdsong and the breeze. A question was raised by a younger listener, something about duty to the state and the life of the individual. The philosopher paused, smiled faintly, and replied with a story, not a lesson, but an illustration. It involved a farmer, a broken wheel, and the patient repair of both tool and spirit. The group chuckled softly at the end, not because it was funny, but because it felt true. The citizen closed his eyes for a moment, not in sleep, but in stillness. He let the words pass over him like warm water. Around him, no one hurried, no one interrupted. It was a rare space in the city, one where thoughts could be spoken slowly and time could pass without notice. The sun moved across the sky, its rays now angling through the columns and creating patterns on the tiled floor. The philosopher's voice faded as he concluded his thoughts, bowing his head in a quiet gesture of closure. Some clapped gently, others nodded in thanks, and a few stayed seated, lingering in the calm that remained. The citizen stood and stretched his arms softly. He offered a slight bow to the speaker, who returned it with a knowing glance. Then he stepped out of the colonnade and back into the light of the street. Rome waited, its rhythm unchanged, but he walked now with slower breath and a clearer mind, carrying with him the echo of a voice and the feeling of calm clarity that only still thinking can bring. Returning home from the forum's shaded walkways, the citizens stepped quietly into the tablinum, the open-air study situated just off the atrium. It was a familiar space, neither grand nor sparse, but filled with the gentle order of daily routine. A wooden desk stood against the far wall, polished smooth by years of use. Nearby, a narrow shelf held small jars of ink, a few parchment scrolls, and a row of wax tablets stacked neatly in pairs. Sunlight filtered through the courtyard and landed across the table, casting a warm, golden stripe that reached all the way to the floor. The air was still, holding only the faintest scent of lavender oil and dusted parchment. The citizen seated himself with a quiet sigh and reached for a rectangular wax tablet bound in leather. Its dark surface held shallow indentations from an earlier message, long since smoothed away with the flat end of the stylus. He picked up the stylus now, a slender tool of bronze with a fine point on one end and a rounded scraper on the other. He paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. A letter to an old friend in Ostia, perhaps. A short note to his brother about an upcoming visit. A small list of ideas to preserve before they slipped away into the busyness of the afternoon. He leaned forward and began to write. The stylus scratched softly over the wax, a faint whisper of movement as letters formed in careful, deliberate Latin. The script was tidy, practiced. Words flowed not in haste, but in rhythm. He paused occasionally to warm the stylus with his fingers, or to reread what he had written. The wax gleamed gently beneath his hand, catching the sunlight with a soft sheen. Outside the doorway, the sound of sweeping echoed faintly from the atrium. A bird chirped somewhere near the garden wall. A servant's footsteps moved quietly down the corridor, not interrupting but passing like a breeze. He finished one message, then flipped the tablet shut and set it aside, bound now with a leather tie. He reached for another and began anew. This time a list of goods to check in the marketplace, written with the same slow clarity. Olive oil, honey. A new pair of sandals, perhaps, for the young servant boy who had outgrown his. After writing, he warmed the flat end of the stylus slightly and smoothed the surface of a previously used tablet, erasing its contents in slow, circular motions. The wax softened just enough to accept the pressure, and the marks disappeared like footprints in wet sand. When he was done, he leaned back, placing the stylus on the table beside the closed tablets. The ink jars remained untouched today. There had been no need for long letters or formal documents. Wax was easier, more immediate, like capturing a breath before it faded. The citizen stood and stretched, letting his arms rise slowly overhead. The sun had shifted again, its light now stretching toward the far wall. He stepped to the doorway and looked out into the atrium, where the impluvium's surface shimmered with soft ripples. Another letter written, another moment preserved. He would send the tablets later with a servant. There was no urgency. Words, once written, would find their way. And with that, he stepped away from the desk, leaving behind the gentle scent of warmed wax and the echo of thoughtful silence. As the sun climbed higher, casting soft light into the atrium's open roof, the household shifted once more into a slower rhythm. The city outside had grown livelier, but within the domus, things quieted. This was the hour for rest, for nourishment, and for stillness. The bustle of the early morning was done, and the heat of the day encouraged ease rather than effort. A low table had been set near the impluvium, where the breeze drifted in gently from the courtyard garden. The water in the central pool shimmered beneath the sun, sending soft reflections dancing across the painted walls and floor mosaics. The scene was peaceful, timeless, a balance of stone, light, and moving air. The midday meal was not grand, but thoughtful. A servant moved gracefully between the kitchen and the table, placing each dish with care. A bowl of lentil stew, still warm, sat in the center. Next to it, a platter of figs and apples, their skins shiny and smooth. There was a small dish of olives, glistening with oil, and wedges of goat cheese dusted with herbs. Loaves of fresh bread, torn into rough quarters, gave off a faint scent of wheat and smoke from the oven. A cup of watered wine rested at the side of each plate, light, aromatic, refreshing. The cups themselves were simple pottery, smooth and cool to the touch. The citizen entered without ceremony, greeted the others with a nod, and sat upon a low bench, folding his tunic beneath him for comfort. A few family members and trusted guests joined, their voices soft and unhurried. This was not a time for politics or planning. It was a moment to pause. They ate in silence at first, appreciating the flavors and the quiet. The lentils were earthy and warm, flavored with onion, coriander, and a hint of vinegar. The bread, when dipped in oil, softened on the tongue and carried the sharpness of crushed herbs. The fruit was sweet and familiar, not a surprise, but a comfort. After a while, conversation began, gentle, idle talk of small things. A neighbor's garden, the color of new tunics in the marketplace, a child's mischief with a chicken in the courtyard. There was laughter, but it was soft and brief, rising like the call of a distant dove, and then fading again into the calm. A servant refilled the wine. The fig tree outside the atrium cast long shadows across the floor. The impluvium, still and mirror-like, held a single drifting leaf that traced slow circles in the water. When the food was mostly gone and the wine nearly finished, the group lingered, not in laziness, but in appreciation. The midday heat pressed gently against the world beyond, but here, inside the shaded walls, everything felt cool and measured. There was no sense of time, no rush. One of the guests leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Another pulled a wax tablet from his belt, idly tracing lines upon it with the back of a stylus. The citizen watched them with calm contentment, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his plate. Eventually, one by one, they rose, not hurriedly, but naturally, as though the house itself had decided it was time to move again. The servants gathered the dishes quietly, leaving behind only the scent of herbs and bread, and the faint sound of water continuing to trickle into the basin. The citizen remained seated for a few minutes more, eyes half-lidded, listening to the hush of the household, the true rhythm of Rome, not found in the shouting of senators or the march of legions, but in moments like this. And when he finally rose, it was with the slow grace of a man full not only from food, but from peace. After the midday meal, the domus grew still once again. The sun now hung directly overhead, casting short shadows through the courtyard and warming the stone walls. Outside, the streets of Rome shimmered in the heat, and even the noise of the city softened as people retreated indoors. Merchants closed their stalls. Work paused. The whole city, it seemed, sighed into stillness. Within the house, shutters were drawn part way to dim the light. The breeze that passed through was slow and warm, carrying with it the faint scent of crushed herbs from the courtyard garden. The air was thick with the comfort of rest, not sleep in its deepest form, but a soft, easy dozing that wrapped the body in stillness and left the mind to drift. The citizen made his way quietly to a private chamber, small and shaded. The walls were painted in warm colours, ochre, soft green, and faded red, with simple patterns winding along the edges like ivy. A couch stood near the far wall, its cushions plump and familiar, its linen covering washed and cool. He removed his sandals, placed them neatly beside the door, and sat slowly on the edge of the couch. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing in the calm. His eyes traced the soft curve of the ceramic oil lamp resting on a shelf, unlit but ready. The gentle hush of the house surrounded him like water in a pool. He lay back, resting his head on the cushion, folding one arm across his chest. Outside, somewhere beyond the shuttered window, a dove cooed gently. The fountain in the atrium still whispered in the background, steady and low. No footsteps echoed now, no voices carried. The household had settled into its pause. He closed his eyes. Sleep did not come sharply, but softly. First, his body relaxed, shoulders sinking into the fabric, fingers loosening, legs stretching slightly as the coolness of the couch settled over him. Then, his thoughts slowed. The letter he had written, the walk through the forum, the quiet voice of the philosopher. They did not vanish. They simply faded into gentle shapes, like shadows moving across stone. The room around him held its breath, cradling him in quiet. Dust motes drifted slowly through the sliver of light that passed beneath the shutter. Time stretched and thinned, its edges softening like cloth in water. He dreamed of nothing specific, only a sense of warmth, of peace, of the weight of his body giving way to stillness. Somewhere nearby, a servant passed through the hall, footsteps barely audible. A door creaked faintly, then closed. A breeze stirred the curtain and passed over his bare feet. And still, he rested. He did not need hours, just a little time, a short descent into calm that would carry him gently back into the second half of the day. The ancients believed rest was not laziness but wisdom, a reset, a return to balance. Eventually, his eyes opened again, not suddenly, but with ease. The room looked the same, quiet and dim. He lay there for another moment, simply breathing, feeling the weight of his limbs and the softness of the fabric beneath him. Then slowly, he sat up. He put his sandals back on, stood, and straightened his tunic. The domus remained quiet. The city outside still dozed beneath the sun. And he, refreshed and unhurried, stepped back into the world, moving like the day itself, gently forward. The sun had begun its slow descent across the Roman sky. its light turning from sharp gold to something softer, warmer. Shadows stretched longer across the stone streets, and the city stirred gently once more, like someone waking from a long, peaceful rest. The heat of the day had broken. It was the perfect time to visit. The citizen stepped out of his domus and made his way along a quieter lane, lined with poplars and ivy-draped walls. His destination was not far. A friend's villa, nestled just beyond the edge of the bustling forum, tucked behind a tall iron gate and shaded with trees that rustled softly in the late afternoon breeze. The road was familiar. He passed homes with courtyards open to the air, where laughter and light conversation echoed faintly. A young boy chased a hoop across the stone path, giggling as it bounced toward a fountain. A woman swept her threshold with calm, rhythmic strokes, humming something ancient and slow. When he arrived at the villa, the gate had already been opened for him. A servant greeted him with a soft nod and a gesture to enter. Inside, the air was cool and carried the scent of lemon leaves and fresh water. The peristyle garden welcomed him with its quiet grace. Trimmed hedges, white flowers in bloom, and a gently gurgling fountain at the centre. Birds flitted between the branches, their wings casting flickers of shadow on the tiled walkway. His friend met him beneath the colonnade with a warm expression and an outstretched hand. There were no formalities, only shared peace between men who had known each other through many seasons. They walked together slowly through the garden, speaking of small things, the condition of the roads, the shape of this year's harvest, a line of poetry overheard earlier in the week. Servants brought out a small tray with cups of cool, spiced wine and a bowl of almonds dusted with salt. They sat beneath a fig tree, its branches reaching just enough to shade the bench, and listened to the soft rustle of the leaves above. Their conversation wandered, not in haste, but in gentle curves. They spoke of a mutual acquaintance who had moved to the coast, of a new bathhouse being built near the port, of the stars above the Palatine Hill. Sometimes there were long silences, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, a space where words didn't need to rush in. The garden held the heat of the day like a memory, slowly releasing it into the cooling air. A dog padded past them, ears perked, before curling up near a sun-warmed patch of stone and drifting to sleep. From a nearby room, the faint sound of a lyre being tuned drifted through an open window. They stayed that way for a while, sipping, speaking, simply sitting. Time, here, was not something to chase. It unfolded on its own. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the white columns and flickering off the pool, the citizen stood, bowing his head slightly in thanks. His friend smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder in farewell. The walk home was slower, quieter. Lamps had begun to glow in the doorways of homes. The scent of roasted garlic and baked grain wafted from kitchens preparing the evening meal. Voices murmured gently from behind shaded curtains. When he reached his own domus, he paused at the entrance, looked once more at the dimming sky, and stepped back into the stillness of his home, carrying with him the calm of the garden, the sound of the fountain, and the warmth of good company. The quiet of early evening settled gently over the domus, like a soft cloak. The sunlight had faded from bright gold to a gentler honeyed tone, streaming in low through the open courtyard and casting long, tranquil shadows across the tiled floor. The air was still warm, but it carried a kind of softness now, a hint of relief from the day's heat. The citizen moved to a small room just off the peristyle, a space set aside for reading, thinking, and moments like this. The walls were lined with narrow shelves, not overflowing, but neatly arranged. Scrolls of papyrus, some bound in leather, others marked with red ribbon, rested in rows. A few clay tablets sat beside them, and a short list carved into a wax tablet was pinned to the edge of the shelf. A personal note of favourite works to revisit. He chose a scroll at random, not by title, but by feel. The worn edge of the casing, the way the leather tie had been wrapped, the faint scent of the material told him this one had been read many times. He unrolled it slowly, the parchment curling in soft spirals as it opened in his hands. The scroll held a series of moral reflections, writings from an old Stoic philosopher, one whose words were not shouted or dramatic, but steady, inward, and thoughtful. The kind of words meant not to stir a crowd, but to calm a single mind. He read silently, lips moving just enough to shape the words but not enough to speak them. His eyes followed the lines slowly, pausing at the end of each sentence not just to absorb the meaning, but to sit with it. There was a comfort in the repetition, familiar phrases that brought peace rather than surprise. Outside, the sounds of the house were subdued. A servant walked softly down the hallway, the soles of her sandals barely brushing the stone. Somewhere beyond the wall, the faint rhythm of someone chopping vegetables in the kitchen could be heard, soft, regular, like a distant heartbeat. He read for a long time without looking up. The scroll rested across his lap, one hand unrolling as the other gently held the start of the text. Each phrase unfolded like breath, measured, grounded, unhurried. The soul becomes dyed with the colour of its thoughts. He paused. Let the words settle. Let their weight sink in, not as instruction, but as reminder. He closed his eyes for a moment and leaned back in his chair, letting the sounds around him melt into a single soft hum. The rustling of leaves, the trickle of the courtyard fountain, the creak of wood as the house settled into night. The scroll remained open in his hands, a bridge between his thoughts and the world before him. The philosopher's voice, long past, echoed gently in the quiet of the room. Not in volume, but in presence. As the last light of the sun slipped beneath the rooftops, he rolled the scroll shut with care, tying it again with the same old leather strap. He returned it to the shelf, placing it in the same spot he had taken it from. A small, familiar space where it would wait for him again. He stood and stretched, feeling the softness of the moment linger around him like a warm cloth. The evening had not yet ended. Dinner would come, lamps would be lit. But for now, the silence of the scroll remained, steady, calm, and full of thought. As twilight began to stretch its long fingers over the rooftops of Rome, the city's rhythm shifted once again. The sharp clangs and chatter of the midday bustle had softened into something slower, gentler. The streets glowed faintly in the evening light, touched by the last golden hue of the sun as it dipped behind the hills. The citizen made his way toward the market, not to shop, but simply to walk, to observe. The forum and stalls were quieter now. Most traders had packed their wares, folding fabrics into baskets, covering jars with cloth, and stacking crates with the ease of routine. The busiest moments had passed, replaced by the gentle winding down of the day. He didn't walk through the market, but instead found a place to sit just beyond it, on a low stone wall beneath a tree with wide, soft leaves. From here, he could see everything without becoming a part of it, the best kind of watching. A woman sold the last of her dates to an older man who laughed softly as he dropped a few coins into her hand. A boy, no more than 10, darted between legs, collecting scraps of string and bits of fruit left behind. A pair of soldiers strolled through, their cloaks draped loosely, not in formation, but in friendship. They spoke in low tones, occasionally nodding to passers-by. Vendors rolled up their cloth awnings, tugging on ropes and poles with practiced ease. The scent of warm olives, roasted nuts, and crushed herbs still lingered faintly in the air, remnants of the day's trade. Somewhere, a lute played a drifting tune, its notes rising and falling like breath. From his place on the wall, the citizen watched without thought or goal. He simply observed the small kindnesses and steady movements of the people. A man helped another load a heavy crate onto a cart. A girl handed her last loaf of bread to a servant and smiled as he bowed in thanks. These moments passed without fanfare, but they were the true pulse of Rome. Not its laws or armies, but its daily motions, its small acts. The sky overhead deepened into shades of lavender and pale blue. A few lamps were lit in the distance, casting warm halos on the stone. Smoke began to rise from the chimneys of nearby homes, curling slowly into the sky. The breeze carried it sideways, softening it before it vanished. The citizen leaned back slightly, resting his hands behind him on the cool stone. He could feel the warmth that the sun had left in the wall, a gentle heat radiating into his skin. He breathed in deeply, the smell of dust and bread and oil filling his chest, and then let it go. He had no need to buy anything today, no list to follow, no task to complete. This visit to the market was not for commerce, but for calm, to be near people without being among them, to witness the quiet ending of another ordinary Roman day. Eventually he stood and brushed the folds of his tunic flat. A vendor waved to him as he passed, and he returned the gesture with a peaceful smile. The market was nearly empty now, but its silence was not hollow. It was full of memory, of movement, of lives lived with purpose, one slow hour at a time. He turned back toward his home, letting the dusk settle around him like a robe. Rome was still awake, but softer now, and so was he. Back within the quiet walls of his domus, the citizen moved through the fading light with slow, practiced steps. The bustle of the city felt far away now, left behind with the market's last flickers and the cooling stones of the forum. The house was lit by soft lamps, their flames flickering gently against painted walls and catching in the polished bronze of door handles and serving dishes. Evening in Rome brought a certain stillness, a kind of reflective calm. And with it came the small rituals that closed the day. One of the most cherished was the evening bath, not the grand public spectacle of the thermae, but a more private cleansing, a final gesture of quiet before night. A servant had already begun preparations in the balneum, the small personal bath chamber just beyond the garden path. A brazier warmed the room with a low fire, and the air was thick with the scent of rosemary and thyme, their leaves steeping gently in a copper basin of heated water. Steam rose slowly, curling along the curved ceiling like soft smoke. The citizen entered the room, unfastening his belt and slipping out of his tunic with care. He placed it neatly on a stool, his sandals beside it. The stone floor beneath his feet was warm from the earlier sun, and the walls seemed to glow in the lamplight, painted with scenes of gentle rivers and reeds, their colours faded but peaceful. He stepped into the shallow pool, the water warm and embracing. It welcomed him not with shock, but with comfort. He lowered himself slowly, letting his limbs relax, the heat drawing the tension from his shoulders, his back, his legs. His eyes closed, and he breathed deeply, the scent of the herbs mingling with the humid air and settling deep in his chest. There was no need to hurry. No voices, no commands, no distractions. Only the sound of water gently lapping at the edge of the basin and the distant chirping of cicadas from beyond the walls. After soaking for a while, he reached for a sponge and washed with calm, methodical movements. First his arms, then his chest, then his legs. A servant poured warm water over him from a jug, rinsing away the day. The water slid down his skin, catching the firelight like strands of gold. Once finished, he stepped out and was handed a soft linen towel. He dried himself slowly, then allowed the warm air of the room to finish the task as he stood for a moment in silence. The servant offered a small dish of perfumed oil, light and fragrant, with a hint of citrus and myrrh. He rubbed it into his arms and neck, the scent rising faintly as the oil warmed on his skin. He dressed again in a fresh tunic, looser and lighter for the evening. His hair, still damp, was combed gently with a wide-toothed comb made from bone. The soft drag of it through his hair felt grounding, final, like the closing page of a scroll. Leaving the balneum, he passed again through the garden. The fig tree rustled softly in the breeze, its branches casting swaying shadows along the stone path. The stars were beginning to appear, faint at first, then sharper with each passing breath. The evening bath had done its work. His mind was still, his body light. The day had been long, but it had passed gently, and now, night had begun. As night settled over Rome and the last glimmer of sunlight faded behind the rooftops, the domus shifted once more, not into silence, but into softness. Lamps were lit in the corners of rooms, their flames small and golden, casting dancing shadows against the walls. The air had cooled, and the scent of herbs and baked grain now mingled with something new. Roasted garlic, stewed lentils, and the warm aroma of slow-cooked chickpeas in olive oil. In the triclinium, the formal dining room, preparations were nearly complete. The name came from the 3 couches that surrounded the low wooden table, though this evening would be informal, simple, just family, and perhaps a quiet guest. There would be no elaborate feast, no musicians, no hired entertainment. Just the last meal of the day, meant to satisfy and calm. Servants moved through the room with practiced ease. They laid out clean cloths over the table and placed clay plates and small cups at each seat. A fresh loaf of bread was sliced and arranged in a shallow basket, the crust still crackling faintly as it cooled. Jars of wine and water stood nearby, ready to be poured in whatever proportion each person preferred. No one drank to excess. The wine was for comfort, not celebration. From the kitchen came the low clang of a pot being set aside, and the soft splash of broth being ladled. A large bowl of porridge made from barley and herbs was carried in, followed by a dish of boiled beans, seasoned with vinegar and mint. Another servant followed with grilled vegetables, carrots, leeks, and slices of squash, arranged with quiet pride. Each dish was modest, but made with care. The citizen entered the triclinium slowly, dressed now in a light evening tunic, his hair still slightly damp from the bath. He paused at the entrance, taking in the scene, the glow of the lamps, the soft clinking of utensils being placed, the scent of the food. There was something timeless about it all. He had eaten here many evenings before, and would again many evenings to come. But each time felt like a small ceremony. He moved to his place, reclining gently on one of the couches, propped up on his left elbow as was customary. Others began to enter as well, their voices quiet, their movements graceful. The mood was neither formal nor casual, just familiar. the kind of setting where silence was welcome and small talk was not required. The meal began slowly. Bread was passed around, dipped in oil, torn gently by hand. Bowls of vegetables were shared, spoons moving from dish to plate without hurry. The wine was poured and mixed with water, then passed in small ceramic cups. There was no rush. Every bite was savoured. Every flavour, no matter how simple, was appreciated. Someone spoke of the weather. Another mentioned a shipment of grain that had arrived from the coast. The conversation never grew loud or quick. It drifted like steam rising from a warm pot, steady and comforting. As the meal went on, the servant brought in a final dish, a small tray of dates and nuts, paired with a bit of honey and cheese. A soft reward for the end of the day, not grand, but enough. When the food had been eaten and the last sips of wine taken, the group lingered, reclining, breathing, watching the flicker of the lamps as they swayed gently with the breeze that passed through the open doorways. The citizen looked around the room, not with judgment or even thought, but with contentment. The triclinium had done its part. It had offered a space to end the day gently, to nourish without excess, to share company without demand. And when the time felt right, he rose, offered a final word of thanks, and stepped quietly back into the hallway, the scent of roasted herbs still clinging faintly to the folds of his tunic. Though the main dishes had been cleared and the soft clink of bowls and plates had faded, the evening still lingered in the triclinium. Rome did not rush its nights, and neither did those who dined within the domus. The oil lamps burned steadily, their flames casting warm, flickering reflections on the mosaic floors. The air was fragrant with the fading scents of food, smoke, and summer night. The couches remained partly occupied, their cushions now relaxed beneath the forms of those who reclined upon them. The citizen leaned into his elbow, sipping gently from his cup of watered wine. It had grown slightly warmer with time, but the sweetness still clung faintly to the edges of his tongue. He didn't drink to forget or to fill the air, only to accompany the moment. Conversation flowed softly around him, like the current of a slow river. Across the table, one guest told a gentle story. Nothing dramatic, just a memory of a goose escaping the kitchen and wandering through the forum. It earned a few chuckles and a raised eyebrow, but no one laughed too loudly. That wasn't the mood. Another guest responded with a memory of a merchant who once accidentally sold the same basket of olives to two different customers, causing a mild dispute and a lesson in overconfidence. The topics drifted. A recipe for stewed lentils shared from a cousin in Etruria, the shape of clouds over the Palatine earlier that afternoon, and whether figs would be sweeter this season than the last. No one interrupted. No one dominated. The conversation had no point other than to be shared, like the last slices of bread passed gently between hands. A small dog curled at the base of the couch gave a soft sigh, shifting in its sleep. A breeze passed through the open doorway, brushing the flame of one lamp so that its shadow danced along the far wall in a slow, looping rhythm. Someone reached for another date, then changed their mind and set it down again, content instead to watch the patterns on the ceiling as the lamplight wavered. The citizen spoke only now and then. A comment, a question, a smile. He had no need to guide the talk. His presence was enough. He enjoyed the sounds, the cadence of words exchanged in peace, the way a shared space could be filled without effort. When silence did arrive, it was not awkward. It was gentle, like the pause after a soft rain. No one rushed to fill it. They simply sat, letting the stillness grow until it became something of its own. The lamps burned lower now, and the servant returned once to remove the final plates. No one stood. They remained as they were, basking in the calm, as if holding on to the last soft stretch of the day before the quietness of night settled in fully. And when, at last, the citizen rose from his couch, he did so without announcement. He exchanged quiet nods, light smiles, a word of parting to each guest, and walked out through the open hallway, sandals brushing gently against the stone. The air outside was cool now. The stars blinked steadily overhead. The domus behind him returned to its hush, and the conversations of the evening drifted into memory, soft and slow, like steam rising from the last of the wine. The sky above Rome had darkened into a deep, velvety blue. The last hues of sunset had faded beyond the hills, and the stars had begun their quiet watch over the rooftops. A breeze swept in from the west, cooler now, carrying the scent of distant cypress and the faintest trace of smoke from household fires burning low for the night. The citizen made his way through a quiet corridor to a small upper balcony, one that overlooked a quiet stretch of the city. The path there was familiar, the steps smooth from countless walks taken at this same hour. It wasn't a place for spectacle, not grand, like the Palatine's terraces, but it offered a view, and more importantly, a sense of peace. He stepped out onto the stone floor, still faintly warm from the day's sun. The low wall rose to his waist, cool beneath his hands as he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows and looking out. The rooftops below him stretched like gentle waves, tile upon tile glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lamps flickered in windows, soft orange glows that blinked gently from the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked open and closed. Farther off, the steady beat of sandals echoed once before vanishing into the silence. From here, the city felt softer, not as the mighty center of an empire, but as a collection of quiet lives folded into stone and firelight. He could see the outline of the temple domes in the distance, their forms rising above the rooftops like watchful guardians. Closer by, a fig tree leaned gently over a neighboring wall, its leaves rustling like whispers. He breathed in slowly, filling his lungs with the air of night. It was cooler now, clearer. The scents of the city were more subtle in the dark. A hint of laurel, old wood, drying linen from a nearby balcony. The smoke of the evening meals had faded, replaced by the calm scent of earth cooling beneath the stars. The city did not sleep all at once. It drifted, room by room, soul by soul. Somewhere, a woman sang softly to a child. A lute strummed quietly beyond another wall. A pair of men spoke in low tones on the opposite balcony, their words lost to distance, but their gestures slow, reflective. No one hurried. No one raised their voice. Rome had learned to rest in chapters. The citizen stayed at the balcony a long time. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The city's silence was filled with presence, of lives winding down, of lamps being snuffed out one by one, of sandals being placed neatly by doorways. Even the dogs seemed quieter now, content to curl near kitchens and sleep. Above, the stars continued their slow path, unchanging. He looked up for a moment, recognizing a few familiar patterns, names whispered by teachers long ago. He didn't name them tonight. He only watched. When he finally turned to go, the domus behind him was dark and calm. The lamps had been lowered. The walls were cool to the touch. But the peace he had drawn from the view, from the breath of the city and its slow exhale into night, stayed with him. He stepped back inside, and the balcony's breeze followed gently for just a moment. like a final thought or a quiet blessing. The lamps in the hallway flickered low, casting long, soft shadows that danced across the painted walls. The domus had quieted fully now. Servants had retired to their corners. The kitchen fire had been banked for the night, and the garden beyond the atrium lay still, its fountain murmuring quietly in the dark. The citizen walked slowly through the corridor, his sandals now set aside, his bare feet silent on the smooth stone floor. He passed by the impluvium, where the surface of the water reflected the light of a single nearby flame. A few stars above the open roof shimmered faintly in its ripples. The house felt wrapped in calm, not empty, but restful, like a breath fully released. He reached the household shrine, the lararium, built into a niche in the wall. It was small and simple, yet full of meaning. Tiny statues of the household gods stood in their familiar places, flanked by small offerings, a dish of fruit, a few drops of wine, a coin left from an earlier day. Their faces were smooth and watchful, not demanding reverence but inviting it gently. He lit a small taper from the nearest lamp and used it to reignite the tiny flame before the shrine. Its glow illuminated the carved figures in soft gold. He stood in silence for a while, eyes closed, hands folded loosely. No grand oration followed. Only a few quiet words whispered, not for favor or fortune, but for gratitude, for the health of the household, for the peace of another uneventful day, for the company of friends, the simplicity of meals, the breath of cool air, the stillness of sleep. There was comfort in this repetition, the same gestures, the same offerings, the same pause. It was not ritual for show, but for grounding, a reminder that even in a vast city, beneath marble and empire, life was still made of quiet choices and small devotions. When the prayer was finished, he bowed his head slightly and extinguished the taper, leaving the flame before the gods to burn a little longer. He stepped away, leaving the shrine in its soft halo of light. Returning to his chamber, he found the room dim and inviting. A single lamp burned near the bed, its wick low, its oil nearly gone. A breeze passed through the open shutters, stirring the curtain and bringing with it the scent of night jasmine and warm stone. He lay down on the bed, pulling a linen cloth lightly over his legs. The cushion beneath his head gave way gently, and his arms rested at his sides. The day, with all its motions and memories, began to fade. Not abruptly, but like mist at the edge of a field. His thoughts moved slowly now. Of the walk through the forum, the feel of the bath's warmth, the steady voice of the philosopher, the sound of friends laughing quietly over bread. All of it drifted through his mind like soft echoes. Outside, the fountain in the atrium sang its constant lullaby. Inside, the last lamp flickered once, then twice, and finally dimmed. The city would sleep. So would he. The room was nearly dark now. Only the faintest glow remained from the oil lamp, its flame shrinking slowly into the last pool of golden light. Shadows stretched gently along the walls, moving softly with the final flickers of the fire. Outside, Rome had fully quieted. No carts clattered on the streets. No voices rose from the alleyways. The city had exhaled. The citizen lay still on his bed, his breath steady, his body at ease. The linen sheet rested lightly across his chest, and the soft pillow beneath his head cradled him in familiar comfort. The shutters had been left half open to welcome the breeze, and through them, the sound of the courtyard fountain whispered faintly, a rhythm so constant it no longer demanded attention, only soothed. Far in the distance, a dog barked once, then was silent. A night bird called from a tree, its song drifting across rooftops and vanishing into the sky. Somewhere, the flame of another lamp was extinguished with a soft puff. Another life settling into slumber. He watched the ceiling through heavy eyes, the painted patterns faint in the dimness. He did not need to think anymore. The day was complete. The words had been spoken. The meals had been shared. The streets had been walked. There was nothing to recall, nothing to plan. Only the moment. His breath deepened, matching the hush of the house, the weight of the blanket, the cool of the stone beneath, the hush of time folding itself over. There were no dreams yet, just the feeling of falling slowly inward, like sinking gently into warm water, wrapped in quiet, wrapped in peace. His thoughts, if they lingered, were soft and shapeless. A voice from earlier in the day, the scent of olive oil and bread, the warmth of the sun on a balcony wall, small things fading as they passed. Rome outside still stood, its temples, its columns, its winding alleys and courtyards. But here, in this quiet room, in this quiet bed, there was no empire to tend, no duties to uphold, only stillness, only rest. The fountain murmured. The lamp guttered once more, then gave its final flicker. And the citizen, wrapped in linen and peace, surrendered fully to sleep.